Okay. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to come here today and speak with you on this particular topic. We were hoping that this session would have landed a little early in the week, but on the other hand, the old saying is, they save the best for last. Right? But in either case, what I want to do today is to share some of my thoughts with you on the important area of measuring reaction kinetics. And the focus here is really on basically like commercial catalysts. These might be particles, they might be powders. And what we want to do is here today is to kind of start from the larger picture of why we want to do this in the first place. And then what I'll do is I'll get into some of the more technical details of some of the science and technology which is associated with it. Now, if you look at the landscape that we work in, it's really changed a lot in the past 10 to 15 or 20 years, because before our feedstocks that we had were all based upon fossil fuels. And of course, the trend is to replace some or part of these by, of course, like renewables. And of course, we also know that because when we go and buy fuel at the gas pump, we see that the fraction of ethanol in our fuel was 10, is now up to 10, in some cases going to 50%. The same was true with diesel. We see hydrocarbon-based diesel that contains some fraction of synthetic diesel. So the feedstocks that we now feed to our chemical and petroleum refining and other types of processes can be a mixed bag of feedstocks. But in either case, what we want to do is we want to convert those into a wide range of products. We want to do that with catalysts that have increased activity and improved atom and energy efficiency. And that will then, of course, lead to more cleanable and sustainable processes, while at the same time a treatment that's trying to achieve attractive process economics. Of course, the best way to achieve attractive process economics is to solve the problem at what we call the front of the pipe. But we also know that in many older processes, there's a lot of capital that's being spent on dealing with the environmental issues associated with some of the products which are produced. But as we move forward, we know that there's going to be improved processes that lead to new chemistries with new types of catalyst technology. And of course, what we want to do in order to take advantage of our capital, we want to do faster, as pointed out here, and more robust scale-up of our catalyst recipe and also reactors. We oftentimes forget about the fact that scaling up a catalyst recipe from the lab to a commercial scale is typically not a simple process, and it's been my experience in a number of technologies that it's the failure of the ability to scale the catalyst that is actually preventing the process from being sent forward to commercialization. Of course, process safety is, of course, critical, as usual. Having worked at DuPont that started their business producing dynamite or producing gunpowder, this is where they learned their technology on how to practice process safety. Of course, this is, of course, very important. Okay, so we had a recent paper that I wrote with Professor Mike Dukovich, appeared in Advances in Chemical Engineering, where we go over some of these issues. Now, we need to think about what's the reason why we need to study commercial catalysts in the first place. And really the driver for this is really due to the array of chemical reactors that are used in practical processes. Now these reactors, which are kind of sketched here for you, range from packed bed reactors with either multitubular or maybe large-scale adiabatic reactors, which don't contain tubes, shown there on the left. Moving over to trickle bed reactors with gas liquid flow, which can either be operated in either co-current downflow or in counter-current flow, or we basically turn the reactor upside down, if you will, and we run it in upflow, a so-called packed bubble flow reactor. So in that case, we have either the classification of the gas solid or gas liquid solid fixed beds. Now, the type of particles that we see in fixed bed reactors can vary. Here's some examples. These are multi-lobe materials. These are so-called ring materials, and also extrudates. And these are just a small sampling of the various particle sizes which are available and used. Now, we look at moving bed reactors. These are things like ablated beds, larger particles, not quite as big as the ones used in fixed beds, but large enough to be fluidized, which might be used in something like a hydrocracking type of operation, or a rice reactor, which either used in chemical processing or in, of course, petroleum refining. And of course, also the conventional fluid bed reactor, which doesn't, of course, involve circulation of the solids as it does in the moving bed. Of course, in this moving bed, in particular riser, we often operate these in a turbulent flow regime where the particles can undergo significant attrition if we don't have a particle that is not designed with the appropriate type of attrition resistance. So the science of catalyst technology in all these processes is very important. I'm looking at also, there's other types of multi-phase reactors that will catalytic materials. We have conventional stir tank, which may involve the use of slurries, for example, small powder catalyst or homogeneous catalyst. Praxair developed the liquid oxidation reactor. It was an attempt to replace existing stir tank technology for producing terephthalic acid from the air oxidation of paraxylene. And you see over here, we have the trickling solids reactor, catalytic distillation, in which the catalyst is often maintained in bags. For example, the technology that CD Tech has developed. And also moving beds, which have also been developed. Of course, monoliths are widely used not only in like vehicular type of applications, but in stationary sources, and we're going to hear some talks about those today, a little later today. And also the rotating packed bed reactor, which is also a novel device which can operate at very high mass transfer efficiency. So all these reactors are candidates for use in commercial or used in commercial applications, and developing appropriate catalyst technology and mechanics that describe their performance is a very important part of that. Okay. All right, now, what kind of knowledge do we need in order to analyze reactors? Well, in general, we need to understand the reaction mechanism and also the reaction kinetics. In this meeting, a lot of emphasis is placed upon understanding the details of how molecules interact with surfaces and methods used to characterize them. But we also need to understand the rates at which those occur and whether or not those rates can be sustained over a significant period of time that justifies their use from an economic point of view. We also need to understand intraparticle transport effects. Here's an example taken from a fixed bed computational fluid mechanical type simulation. And then we go down to the particle scale, understanding the diffusion, reaction, and other transport effects which can occur in practical particles. We also need to understand in reactors what is the fluid flow pattern, which becomes complex in multi-phase reactors, and how does the voidage vary as you move at different positions in the reactor. And this is a result from a fluid simulation of a circulating fluid bed. So one can get a feel of the types of dynamics which can occur in such systems. Now, the reason why we want to study kinetics is because the reaction kinetics are coupled to the events which occur on the reactor scale, as shown here in this equation. Here we have a multi-phase system in which the concentration of species in one phase is described as some operator L. The simplest operator might be, say, the plug flow operator, or the axial dispersion operator. In more advanced models, we use computational fluid mechanics to describe what that operator really is. Okay, so that is balanced with the observed rate of reaction, the effectiveness factor, multiplied by the rate evaluated at the surface at the bulk conditions, concentration, and temperature. That, of course, can occur in other phases as well, as shown below. So that phase, of course, may have a different mixing pattern. In some cases, it can have a different set of reaction kinetics. So what we're trying to do in an ideal case when we want to look at kinetics, we're trying to basically eliminate, as shown here, the non-ideal effects, or if they are present, to quantify them in some fashion so we understand how they may impact the observed rates that we measure in some particular laboratory reactor. The observed rates that we measure in some particular laboratory reactor. Okay, so let's just take a look at an example of a reaction kinetic model. So we kind of worked our way from the big problem of, say, business down to reactors. Now we're looking more on a local basis on like reaction kinetic models. This example is a reaction kinetic model for Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, which is based on a fairly complicated multi-step microkinetic type of model. Here you can see what the rates of reaction are for the various species. In this case, the net rate of formation of the paraffins and olefins shown here. Here the value of N can vary anywhere from 2 to 20 in this case. So you would have roughly 41 or so reactions 20 from olefins, 20 from paraffins, and water gas shift reaction. So basically this set of equations describes a detailed formation of the paraffins and olefins starting from their respective feeds. Now, if we know a reaction kinetic model, our goal then is to, moving forward, is to incorporate that in some type of particle model to describe what are the transport effects which can occur on the particle scale. And this shows some recent work we did looking at different particle shapes for the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, in which we looked at diffusion and reaction in these different shapes, described by the usual equations that you see here. We actually did this in 1D, but we also later extended it to 3D, so we did account for, in fact, N effects. And here we show what is the transport parameter with effective diffusivity, and some previous work by Wang showed how those diffusivities vary for CO, for hydrogen and CO2, and then also how they vary as you go to the higher molecular weight components. So knowing the reaction kinetics then, and one can solve these equations, and then you can then describe what is the behavior on a local basis within these various types of particles. And I won't go into this in any great detail, but this just shows, for example, how the concentration profiles for diesel, the C13 to C17 range, how that varies in like different shapes. So this is work done by one of my students, shown here. And we basically looked in great detail at what is the impact of particle shape on performance. You really can't assess it until you put these into an appropriate model for a reactor. And you can show then that there is a shape that can in fact improve the performance over the conventional solid shapes or solid spheres, which are of course commonly used. Okay, another interesting example that we'll talk a little bit later in the talk is basically commercial sulfuric acid catalyst. This shows different shapes of which are available, ranging from the smaller type, so-called type 210, which are like basically these solid cylinders, okay, up to these 10 millimeter rings, up to what I call boulders, these 20 millimeter rings, okay. And then we have, of course, the daisy shapes. Now, what's happened in this technology over the years, the shape has evolved. It's evolved for several reasons. It's evolved because, number one, they want to obtain particles that have, of course, a higher activity, which means that you'll have a reduced SO2 emissions. But they also want to reduce particles that result in a reduced pressure drop. Turns out those are two counterposing things. We know smaller particles in general will give us a higher pressure drop, but also improved activity. So the game has been to try to figure out how do you add these lobes and other types of artifacts on top of regular shapes in order to increase activity while, of course, minimizing the pressure drop. The pressure drop is very important because these plants are large, and of course you're moving around a lot of gas. If you're producing 1,000 metric tons of acid a day, it's very important to try to minimize the pressure drop because that, of course, impacts energy. Now, Again, we could use that same approach that I showed earlier, and we could examine the detailed performance of these various particle shapes. So in the past, a lot of work went toward trying to identify optimal shapes, but by the use of modeling tools, one can start to examine what is the impact of shape, not only on pressure drop, but also on the effectiveness factor or the activity of the catalyst for a given microkinetic type of model. This just shows some examples from some of our recent work where we look at different types of particle shapes, shown here, the so-called rounded step or the so-called light bulb type of catalyst, and one can start to understand what is the connection between the details of the geometry of these particles, and how does one start to introduce some sciences and technology into the particle forming process. Now, the other important factor here, too, also that one has to consider is the fact that one has to worry, of course, about dusting and also the mechanical strength of the catalyst. So you could say, well, I'm going to put bigger holes here. That's going to improve my diffusion and loads. Well, it turns out that there's only so much you can do, because when these are loaded into reactors and people are walking around on top of the particles with their boots on and rakes, and you produce fines that can produce dusting, that results in significant pressure drop and premature shutdown of the plant. So it's very important to not only understand how these catalysts perform from a reaction diffusion point of view, but also the next thing we're taking a look at is how does mechanical strength impacted by these different shapes. And that, of course, gets into the science of materials and has a kind of a mechanical engineering type of element to it. Now we could take one of these particles and we could put it in like a flow field, and you could then start to examine, well, how does it behave, and what is the role of the fluid mechanical behavior on the catalytic performance. So this is just a single particle that's in like a flow field, but this just illustrates, of course, the behavior of the particle, and of course how you can see that really the behavior of the concentration and the temperature field is, of course, it's not a symmetric type of behavior that we typically use when we solve diffusion and reaction problems. So this is really the reason why when one goes to ensembles of particles and how they may be sitting, even in like a laboratory reactor, that's very important to understand how is the fluid mechanical behavior in the reactor impacting how that particle is performing. All right, now what I want to do is to step back a little bit from that and just do a little review on what are the main types of laboratory reactors that are used in practical types of applications. In general, they can be broadly divided as shown here. We, of course, have integral reactors where we have a significant change in the concentration. We try to aim for a plug flow behavior. And of course, it's possible in this case to have a significant change in concentration from the bulk to the surface, and also in the actual particle itself, which we just saw in those examples which I just illustrated. Now, if you operate the reactor at a lower level of conversion, in the, say, 5 to 10% range, then we still can have these significant intraparticle effects, but maybe the intraparticle effects are smaller in that case because the conversion is low. Now, the other approach, of course, is to recycle this, is to recycle the product gas, and now, of course, we have so-called recycle reactor, commonly referred to as the loop reactor. Now, in this case, it's possible to have large-like gradients, but by having high enough gas velocities, one can minimize the intraparticle gradients and still have intraparticle gradients present. Well, and finally, we can have the classical stirred tank reactor, which we work with commercial particles. We can still have gradients in that particular device. So these are the primary targets that you're trying to achieve in some type of laboratory reactor when you're evaluating heterogeneous reaction kinetics. Now, if you go back, you can find over the years, there's been much has been written about these different types of reactors. And that's why when you go into the R&D labs of most companies, you'll find a wide variety of reactors in many cases which are used. Although today there's been a drive toward trying to have some standards in certain types of R&D labs. So this just shows some of the different types of reactor configurations, and this was actually written in the late 1970s. but many of these reactor configurations are still used. I'm not going to go into detail in each of these because we don't have time today, but what I want to mention is just a very kind of, I consider it kind of a classical paper, or rather, actually a classical paper written by Joe Birdie, entitled 20 Years of Recycle Reactors, and that appeared in this paper here. He also wrote a very nice book, which appeared in the Studies in Surface Science and Catalysis, in which he explains nicely in detail how one can use recycle reactors to study reaction kinetics. Now, let's take a minute here and look at the jet loop reactor design concept. One of the reasons for looking at this particular design, because unlike some of the other reactors that we'll see here in just a moment, it doesn't involve any moving parts. When you deal with certain types of gases, which are very corrosive, moving parts can lead to significant maintenance problems, especially if actually used in a number of commercial type of reactors. So one introduces the feed through a nozzle. This produces a high-speed jet. If you go into the literature, like fluid mechanics, you see jets have been widely studied. There's a lot of knowledge out there on how jets behave in single and multi-phase systems. In this case, the jet is introduced into a draft tube. And what that does is that creates a delta P between the inlet and outlet. So that delta P then results in a circulation in the system. And with appropriate design jet and also geometry, one basically can create a backmix type of environment in this type of system. So therefore, what's very attractive about this approach is that the reaction rate can be, of course, computed directly as the difference between the molar flows in the inlet and outlet divided by some measure of the catalyst weight, metal, or what have you. Now, it turns out that the loop concept is not a new one, and if you look in the literature, you'll see that different types of jet loop reactors have been proposed. And here's some examples of a couple designs. One of them here shown on the left, this is the type in which there's a jet which is internal, and so the circulation pattern is from the draft tube around in this fashion over here, and the catalyst is maintained in a small thin layer on the angular portion of the jet. In another design, this is a loop type reactor in which the jet is placed here, the catalyst is placed on the opposite side, the high-speed jet is introduced, induces a flow, and the gas is withdrawn on the exit. Now, so we became very interested in this idea, and the reason why was because one of the applications we were looking at involved some gases which are very corrosive. So when we looked at some of the classical internally recycled reactors, which are shown here, one by Lightberg and Wilson, Birdie's for a classical reactor, also one by Caldwell. Just for your information, of course, the reason why this one here was made was the so-called pancake design. One could obtain a higher tip speed here. Therefore, one could have a higher circulation rate, and which would lead to improved mass transfer characteristics. Now, here we have a diagram of a jet loop reactor developed by Klaus Mulder. He has various designs. Some are made of glass and other types of materials. But if you compare the design parameters for these different systems, you see that really, in general, the jet loop is a simpler design. And in particular, you can make it from glass or other types of materials that suit your environment. And it basically relies upon proper design of the jet and proper selection of some other geometrical parameters in order to obtain a backmix gas. From a cost point of view, we can fabricate these things cheaper relative to the price of a classical stir type device. In fact, some of the ones we've constructed even with Hastelloy and other exotic metals, we've fabricated those for under $1,000. When they break, you just replace one of the parts, or you just throw them away. So this shows some of the commercially available internal recycled reactor designs. which one can purchase from autoclave engineers. Par reactor has a design, and these are based upon the classical Carberry spin basket reactor. This is the Verdi, the classical Verdi reactor, or of course the Caldwell type of reactor. So those are still available, and they're used quite a bit to study reaction kinetics for commercial shapes. Now, it was shown in some work that the Carberry design actually can result in some mass transfer deficiencies, because as the basket spins, it drags the gas along, so the difference in velocity between the particle surface and the actual gas is not very, very large, so that can result in some mass transfer limitations, but it actually led to the Caldwell and also to the Verdi types of designs. Now, if one is working with powders, the classical approach is to put those into a little packed bed or a mini fluid bed and to measure the performance. And there's other devices that also can be used. For example, there's microbalance reactors, which allow you to measure the weight of the powder as well as the compositional change. What I think is very interesting design is the one that was developed by Hugo de Lasso at his Chemical Reactor Center at the University of Western Ontario. And it sort of leverages the knowledge from the Verdi reactor in the sense that you can use a catalyst powder, but that catalyst powder is maintained in a little chamber here, if you will, and so therefore the powder is maintained in a back mixing type of environment. So by basically changing the feed composition, one could basically cover a very large range of gas compositions that you might encounter in a typical riser type of system. He's shown, for example, how this has been used to measure the kinetics of various types of feedstocks. Here's an example here of a kinetic steam that he had developed for basically gasoline using an 8-month type of model. Now I want to spend a little remaining time talking a little bit about our loop reactor that we used to look at the kinetic measurements for commercial sized particles. The application here was the oxidation of SO2 to SO3. There's about more than 1,500 plants worldwide, and of course there's increasing pressure to develop improved technology that results in a reduced SO2 emissions. This is a diagram of one of our reactors. This chamber over here is the one that holds the hums of particles. This can hold 4 or 5 up to 20 millimeter particles, which are commercial size shapes. And here's the gas inlet, the gas outlet. And in order to measure the gas recycle rate, we use a pitot tube in order to do that. And this shows a little cold flow setup that was used to examine how the recycle rate varies with different process parameters. So basically, we use our pitot tube, and from that we're able to measure the velocity. And then from the velocity, we can show, of course, how the volumetric flow rate in the recycle line changes as a function of say, pressure. And then from that, we're able to examine what is the effect of various parameters on the recycle rate. We spent quite a bit of time looking at different types of nozzles. Here's a typical nozzle. Basically, it's a 1/4-inch O2 tube that has an opening. Here's a typical opening, might be like 1/10,000 of an inch. It's important we find that for those nozzles to be filtered, otherwise small solids can get in there and, of course, plug these things. It's also important to have nozzles which result in what we call kind of a clean get. So it's important to design the nozzle correctly. We can describe how the nozzles operate simply by applying the macroscopic energy balance. And here's an example of an experiment in which the nozzles were tested with like feed gases over a fairly large range of flows. And we looked at the flow as a function of the back pressure, and we could basically nicely correlate what is the predicted pressure that we're able to achieve with those different types of nozzles. Now this illustrates one example of several different parameters that were studied. How does the nozzle position and the nozzle opening affect the recycle rate? Here we're using like a 20 millimeter particle, an actual commercial particle, and with 3 different types of sizes of like nozzles, and then we vary the nozzle and its distance from the particle bed. So you can see, number one, it's possible under certain circumstances to get recycle rates up to 50 or so in this particular configuration. Typical recycle rates might be in the order of 25 to 30, which is high enough for the particular chemistry that we were studying. So in the next few slides, I'll summarize some results from the jet loop being applied to SO2 oxidation. So one of the original reasons for doing this is because we wanted to look at what was called the wet acid kinetics. This is when water is injected in the feed of a typical system. So in a typical dry type process, you will run 4 passes of SO2 oxidation to SO3, starting out with an inlet temperature of 420 degrees C or so, and operating that reactor in stages. And like the wet gas process, as practiced by DuPont NCS, Sulfox technology, and also Topsoe's WSA process, water is injected in the stream. So one has a so-called wet gas type of process. As you can imagine, corrosion can be a significant issue. Like a Verdi reactor was used in this process, it underwent significant corrosion. It was not really usable after a relatively short period of time. And this is a diagram of an automated system that we developed, in which a jet loop reactor was the workhorse of it. And in this system here, we can feed a mixture of SO2, oxygen, and nitrogen into a series of mass flow controllers. And what we do over here, we actually can generate SO3 online, so we're then able to vary the feed gas composition to the loop. So therefore, we can cover a range of SO2, oxygen, as well as SO3 compositions, but therefore allow us to mimic what happens in a typical multi-stage type of process. Now shown here is the case when water was injected, and there was a pump that was here and that was used to inject water, so we could examine not only the wet gas process, but the dry gas process as well. Now this shows typical rate data that was obtained in the system here using a cesium-vanadium type of catalyst on 5mm rings, where these data correspond to the rate as conversion as a series of temperatures. And of course you can see right away what is the real simplicity of using such a device, because the rate can be very easily computed from the measured conversion in the W over FA naught data. Now here we look at the rate data obtained from various types of catalysts just to illustrate how not only composition but also how the device can be easily used to obtain rate data for various types of catalysts. So here we compare the performance of a Topsoe VK69 catalyst shown here to some other catalysts which were made, in which these were based upon some are noble metals and other types of materials. So the method is very sensitive and able to detect significant changes in rates. Here are some comparison of the kinetics for dry gas versus wet acid process. These data is one example of data which is produced. This is a parity plot which compares the experimental rates to the model predicted rates based upon an equation shown here. And because the system is basically automated, one can define an entire set of experiments, in this case the box-making type design. In that design, we varied the SO2 and oxygen composition. In other designs, we also varied the SO3 composition. But this was for a pass one case where there's no SO3 present in the feed. And then in the case of the wet acid process, we can vary the SO2, the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, and the water. And we can vary also, of course, the rate, hour, space velocity of the gas. So this shows a comparison of the rates to the compares experimental rates to the model predicted rates. And this is something that was able to be achieved in any other type of reactor because of the complications associated with dealing with the corrosive type of environment. Okay, so unfortunately, I didn't have time to go into some other methods which are used. We actually are working on a manuscript that would include some of those other other key details, but today I just wanted to give you a higher level overview of the capabilities of such devices. Now there are, of course, advanced versions, which can be made, in which you can put windows in there. You can do other types of things to monitor solids, the behavior of solids, and also different types of detection systems for the gases. One can actually create a whole array of loop reactors that can be operating under different sets of conditions. So what is one of the key things is that this device can be easily fabricated from your chosen material of construction, which can be very important in various types of applications because, in say, for example, in like oxidation reactions, the metal can of course catalyze the reaction. So of course it's simple. There are no moving parts, and it's relatively inexpensive to fabricate. In the work that we've done, we've been able to obtain recycle rates up to 50, which was quite adequate for the kind of applications we were working in. By varying the nozzle and other parameters, one can actually obtain recycle rates as high as 100 to even like 200. One of the real advantages, of course, of having an automated system, of course, you could operate it safely with the proper interlocks and unattended operation, so data can be collected over multiple days of operation, and then produce the information which is needed to support process operations. So since it's the last day of the conference, and since it's been raining in Texas, I think when I go home, I think my front yard, I'm going to need a boat in order to get over to my house. But I wish you all a safe trip home, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, so questions? Nobody? So maybe I have a question. So I would like to, when you compared different types of catalysts for the wet acid process, were they of the same shape? So was the difference really in the kinetics, or does it include also the internal diffusion effect?
Well, when the wet acid, first of all, I guess what you need to know about the wet acid process, the feed composition in a typical wet acid process is different than it is for like a dry gas process. Okay? So like a typical wet acid process, the feed composition might be a maximum of say 5 to 6% of sulfur dioxide. It also may contain a lot of carbon dioxide and also water. Okay? Whereas in a conventional dry gas process, your feed might be 11 to 12% SO2, 9 to 10% oxygen. Okay, there's no like CO2 present and there's no water present. So you're really what the catalyst really sees is this really like a totally different gas environment. Okay, it turns out that the same catalysts are used in those two processes. Okay, however, up until this point, there was really no way to measure the reaction kinetics. Okay. They simply knew how catalysts would operate based on plant performance. Okay, so now we have a tool to do that. Okay, so to answer your question, the same catalysts are used, but however, I think there's an opportunity to develop different catalysts that may have higher activity, because now you have a way of measuring that type of activity, in a fashion which doesn't require that you use your plant as like a pilot plant.
Okay, but I mean, so you tested the powders? Or
oh, no, these are actual commercial shapes.
Okay, and were they really substantially different, or?
Oh, the rates are rates.
No, I mean the shapes.
No, we
the same shape.
Yeah, same
just
shape.
Pure kinetic.
Yeah, same shape in a wet acid gas environment and in like a dry gas environment. Of course, varying the compositions and so forth. But in like a wet acid process, you don't have the typical 4 to 5 passes that you have that you would have in like a dry gas process. Okay, so there's a different like configuration in the process itself. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, let's thank our speaker again.